Good afternoon and welcome to this session of the Festival Living with Race. Today's session is titled Challenge Ophelia Doing Shakespeare in the Anthropocene. For those of you who haven't been here with us today in the last few days, Living with Race is a festival that is part of the project called Race, Green Europe After Citizenship and the Environment, which is funded by the Erasmus Plus program and promoted by the University of Trento. It's a project and the festival itself dedicated to education, active citizenship, and the climate crisis. I'm very pleased to welcome and to introduce our speaker today. Professor Shaul Bassi is full professor of English literature and environmental humanities at the University of Foscari in Venice, and where he founded and directed the International Center for the Humanities and Social Change, which eventually led to a pioneering master's degree program in environmental humanities. His work moves across quite a wide range of fields, from Shakespeare to post-colonial literature, from Jewish studies to the environmental humanities. And Professor Bassi has taught at several institutions, like, for example, UC Santa Cruz, the Wake Forest University, and he's teaching at the Harvard Foscari Summer School in Venice. He's also the co-founder of the literature festival called Incroci di Civiltà, Crossroads of Civilizations. Today's lecture will take us to somewhere perhaps unexpected, to Shakespeare, not as a detour from the climate crisis, but as a way into it. And through plays like Hamlet, The Tempest, King Lear, and The Merchant of Venice, we'll explore how Shakespeare speaks to the ecological anxiety, to our relationship with nature, and also to tensions between generations and community. And so this is maybe also a way to show that science and the humanities need each other, and that maybe Shakespeare, among all people, has still something to tell us. So I hope you enjoy the webinar, the workshop, and thank you again very much for accepting our invitation. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Daniela Ferrari. Thank you to the organizers. I'm totally delighted to be here. And I appreciate that the first session after lunch is always particularly challenging. So I hope I will be able to keep you awake and alert. How many English teachers, professors here? Okay, that's wonderful. And how many of you love to do Shakespeare or find Shakespeare? Oh, well, what a no-brainer. Okay, sorry about that. And I would love also to hear from other colleagues who do not do that as their main occupation, but have some space for Shakespeare in their lives. All right, so my talk is divided roughly into two sections. One is a sort of overview of how we can link different plays by Shakespeare to specific ecological themes. And then there's a second part that focuses specifically on Hamlet. So, and then I'll be happy to perhaps go back and talk more about any particular play that you may be fond of. So, by way of introduction, as it was kindly recalled, I am part of a program that is called Environmental Humanities. This is the first master's degree in Italy. There was a master, like, you know, that the difference between master and laurea magistrale. This is the first laurea magistrale in Italy, fully in English, in environmental humanities. And it is based on, I would say, two pillars. And one is a fantastic book, a book that literally changed my life, called The Great Derangement, that in Italian has been, interestingly, and with the approval of the author, translated as La Grande Cecità, by Amitav Ghosh, where Amitav Ghosh says that 20 years from now, and now it's 10 years from now, because he wrote that 10 years ago, it says, people will look back and will ask why everybody was not just focusing exclusively on that. And the great novelist that he is also said literature has failed to account for the magnitude and impact of the environmental crisis. Much as I admire him, he doesn't reference Shakespeare. And so I believe that to some extent we have to be more faithful to and hopeful and trust his novels as well. And also this wonderful point of view of Carla Benedetti, the author of this book with a slightly overambitious title, Literature Will Save Us from Extinction. I'm not entirely sure, but I think her line saying that the ecological emergency doesn't change the future alone, it also changes the past. I see that our students, we are blessed with students coming from all over the world, literally. But a lot of students fail to understand that, or at least fail to appreciate that if you try to explore climate change, address climate change, you cannot just focus on the last 50 years. You cannot just look at the great acceleration. You cannot just look at the present. You have to delve into the past. And so in order to explore what Ghosh calls this crisis of the imagination, I think that I have found that Shakespeare is a wonderful companion, someone that Shakespeare, for some reason, manages to be about just anything we are interested in. Now I will start from something that is very, very simple and basic, that you all know, that it is still the case that a lot of people hear the word Shakespeare, the name Shakespeare, and they feel kind of paralyzed. They feel they are not looking at what essentially was not really pop culture, but big entertainment in the late 16th and early 17th century. But it is not that highbrow cultural form put on the pedestal in the 18th century. And that, on the other hand, Shakespeare managed to be, at least it has been for the last several decades, our contemporary. This is the title of a very, very famous book by the Polish critic Jan Kot. And the keyword that is the first of many keywords that I want to share with you. So the next slides will have one keyword and some quotes from Shakespeare and some ideas I would like to discuss, is adaptation. So adaptation is a fantastically flexible term that has an application in biology, has an application in history, and also in terms of how we relate to Shakespeare. Shakespeare wrote for the stage. Nowadays, if I ask my students if they've ever seen Shakespeare on stage, I'm afraid that even though they are students of English literature, 99% of them have never seen a play on stage. But many of them have seen a film, which is to some extent a more modern version or kind of equivalent. To a large extent, Shakespeare is, in my opinion, an equivalent to sort of Hollywood producer, director today. So someone taking a story written as a tale, as a historical chronicle available to few, and then make it available to many. How many of you saw Hamlet? How many of you liked Hamlet? How many of you, nya? Okay, good. How many of you really hated it? Okay, that's fine. That's fine. Just, it would be, this is something I haven't really thought about, but it would be lovely if we have time to discuss what is the, let's say, the environmental angle perspective on Hamlet. yeah, there's certainly something there. Adaptation is also the overarching theme of a project of our department, and it's wonderful that we can take that category and say that in order to adapt to a changing world, we can adapt Shakespeare. And the idea is that, among other things, I think that we need art. I need the humanities. We need philosophy. We need history. We need good literature to keep us company in these very troubled ages. I live in Venice. Venice is sort of on the edge of climate change. In the last few years, sea level rise is paradoxically invisible because we are now protected by these huge barriers called mose. And so my students no longer know what acqua alta is. But if you've been to Venice and you've seen maybe some footage of that, acqua alta was very much the experience of everyone being in Venice. So now you don't see it because we are protected. At the same time, it is more threatening than ever. And so when we move to the second part, we'll see how my students and I have tried to create a kind of triangulation as Shakespeare in Venice and see how that plays out. Keyword, eco-criticism. Whatever I'm telling you comes from a variety of studies that in the last 20 odd years have literally flooded Shakespeare criticism. Shakespeare criticism has become very, very, I would say, political, social in the new millennium. Interestingly enough, I am one of those who was not interested in ecology at all. I was, and I confess that because I think it's important to understand that for a lot of people, the environmental crisis is not something we really want to deal with. Of course, I'm preaching to the conference, to the choir here, so there's not much need to say that. But I belong to that generation that started being interested in Shakespeare and race, gender, and class, and nature was not something that was, to me, particularly interesting. So eco-criticism is an umbrella term, but then you have more specific terminology with, eco-critical theory, and then more generic one like green Shakespeare, Shakespeare and ecology, more general studies like Shakespeare representation of weather, climate, and environment. So ecological Shakespeare comes in a lot of forms and critical languages. And I have myself, and I think this is why I earned an invitation here, that's very good, decided to mostly translate this wonderful work done in English into Italian with a little book called Pianeta Ophelia that was published in 2024. It goes without saying, please interrupt me at any time if you have any questions, observations. I would love to hear about your experiences with Shakespeare and in the class. I decided to use the word fare in the subtitle of the book and also in the subtitle of this lecture, precisely because I think it's a very practical approach to Shakespeare that allows us to engage with our themes. Of course, we can read it, we can watch it, we can enjoy it, but the whole idea for me is really to do something very, very concrete, very practical, and in many ways. And just to utilize an easy, I'll say, a cliche. We can think of Shakespeare as a master of recycling. Shakespeare was or of upcycling. Famously, those who didn't like Shakespeare always pointed out that he didn't invent anything. He was always recycling someone else's plots. So the first liberating thing is to say Shakespeare was not the kind of genius that created anything ex nihilo out of nothing. He took a book, it took a short story, it took a chronicle, and then says, all right, that's interesting. Let's change a few names, let's change a few things. Let's put everything in modern dress. I love the fact that a lot of people don't like modern dress Shakespeare, but Shakespeare was modern dress himself, and so in a way, I think upcycling Shakespeare is what we are aiming at. My next keyword is climate change. So I pointed out how students tend to be, when they decided to enroll, with a lot of courage in our environmental humanities program, because what are you going to be if you take a degree in environmental humanities? You know that the university always tell us what kind of job you're promising them. And of course you say environmental educator and a lot of different things. But the humanities is about preparing people for jobs that may not exist yet. So this is what I like to tell them. Anyway, even if we want simply to historicize, what is really important to remember, Hamlet is a case in point that Shakespeare himself lived through a kind of environmental crisis. He lived through what has been defined as the Little Ice Age, so a period where temperatures dropped very sharply, or the Great Frost, cold doings in London. And so, in a way, what are the environmental challenges that Shakespeare's society had to face? How many of you have been to the Globe in London? All right, yes. How did the Globe come about? You know that basically they dismantle one theater on the other. Why did they do that? Why did they carry all that? Because deforestation had become a big issue. Queen Elizabeth was very worried about deforestation, and the price of timber had skyrocketed. So when we think about this type of phenomena, we don't have to think that they are just typical of our own age. There was already a certain awareness of preservation of the natural environment. I come, again, from Venice, and the Republic of Venice had a very strict policy about, how many trees. Venice is famously the stones of Venice, but Venice is a city made of wood. It's built on an upside-down forest that needed millions of woods, of trees, of course, and the trees came from the Dolomites, and so there was a very strict, close attention to how many trees you could cut down, how you would bring them. So there is this beautiful moment in Midsummer Night's Dream. Midsummer Night's Dream is, for many, the quintessential ecological play by Shakespeare. I have something else to say about that. There is a passage in Midsummer Night's Dream that is frequently dropped. It's edited out of performances, of films. We know that usually the kind of Shakespeare we get nowadays is abridged. Otherwise, it's too long. You cannot have 5-hour Hamlet or 5 hours Othello. So a lot of things are dropped. What is quite interesting is that in Midsummer Night's Dream, there is a passage that could be read as a denunciation of the anthropogenic form of climate change. So there is a moment where the queen of the fairies, Titania, talks about the complete change of the seasons. Non esistono più le mezze stagioni, as we would say, non esistono più le stagioni. So seasons are being drastically transformed, modified. So it's interesting how you can read a passage like that historically, like old theory of the correspondence between the macrocosm and the microcosm, but also say, listen, why is the climate changing according to the Queen of the Fairy? It comes from our debate, from our dissension. So this is a way of reading a passage that, of course, has a completely different historical explanation, but can be used to say how there is, ironically, a sense in which the early modern period, Shakespeare's time, was aware of the fact that it is human behavior that affects the climate. So I'm by no means suggesting that we should consider Shakespeare a kind of prophet of climate change. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that a lot of his texts lend themselves to fascinating contemporary readings. Why is climate changing? Because of our debate, our dissension. We cannot agree on the responsibilities of the Anthropocene, as it were. And I think it's fascinating that this particular it's a much longer passage than I'm presenting you here, it's frequently dropped, as if it was not interesting. But also because Midsummer Night's Dream is the one play that typically presents a very benevolent and reassuring form of natural environment. If we had more time, I would talk to you, and I think I talk about this in the book, about fascist interpretations of Shakespeare. And one of the fascist interpretations of Shakespeare pitted this kind of green, merry England that was represented in Midsummer Night's Dream and other plays as an ideal society where there was harmony between the human and the non-human. And that harmony, guess what, was threatened by migrants and alien invaders. So these things are a way of have a way of manifesting themselves in a lot of different contexts. But more about Midsummer Night's Dream. Quick overview. What's your favorite Shakespeare play? Othello, Macbeth? Sorry, I don't have Macbeth for you to serve. Okay, but we could talk about that and why. I mean, we could read that as well. Any other play that is someone's favorite? Okay. Winter's Tale. Oh wow, that's kind of yeah, right. Oh yes. Midsummer Night Dream. Biodiversity. A great scholar of Shakespeare, one of the greatest scholars of Shakespeare, Stephen Greenblatt, once said during a lecture, my student says, Midsummer Night's Dream is a very strange play. It's the play that, along with Romeo and Juliet, is the most frequently performed in schools. Those of you who, L'attimo fuggente, Dead Poet Society, Midsummer Night's Dream, in all schools here. And he says, of all plays by Shakespeare, they have school kids perform a play where there's a woman having sex with a donkey. That's what we would call, multi-species relationship, but about that later. There is always this balance of, let's say, gentleness and violence in Shakespeare. And again, there are wonderful passages in this play, in other plays like The Tempest, where we see a list of beautiful fruits or plants or vegetables. I know we have here great experts on food. And I sort of compared in the chapter, sorry if I do a little bit of self promotion. In Pianeta Ophelia, I have 6 chapters. Every chapter has a color. So is the violet chapter, the purple chapter is Hamlet, the blue chapter is The Tempest, the green chapter is Midsummer Night's Dream, red chapter Othello and the Merchant of Venice, and gray chapter is King Lear. So in the green chapter, I juxtapose Midsummer Night's Dream with terrible, meaning great, terrible, meaning that it's a very, say, ominous novel, The Road by Cormac McCarthy, that is one of the great sort of apocalyptic or post-apocalyptic narratives. And I do it for two reasons. One, because you have this father and this son. There is also a great movie. They're walking around this wasteland and they're looking for food. And there is a moment where the food comes in cans. And I use that, and I think there are some apricots there. And I thought that this is the type, not only is this the type of situation that most of us live in, where most of our food is actually not that fresh, but also there is this idea that a lot of, as we know, species are going extinct, that our biodiversity is shrinking, that there's an unprecedented pace of extinction. And so looking at purple grapes, green figs, mulberries, honey bags, still from the humblebees, you have this beautiful, beautiful lyrical list of elements. And this is one of the ways in which one can work in the classroom and start asking the students, what there is their own experience of a place where things grow. How many different types of fruits, if their grandparents and parents have anything that they grow themselves, their knowledge. And then in this beautiful magical atmosphere, and we hear the famous soundtrack of Felix Mendelssohn Bartholdy, who did the symphony, you read closely and says that pluck the wings from painted butterflies. So doing violence to animals. So it's things that I had read that so many times, and I didn't notice how it's actually a way of doing violence to the natural world and to animals. But it's also great to Stephen Greenblatt's joke side to look at this very interesting topic of metamorphosis and this character morphing into an animal and blurring the boundaries between the human and the non-human. So here, one obvious strategy is to show and remind students that there is no one Titania, not one bottom, but there are countless adaptations in the visual arts, on stage. So anything from Marc Chagall to Fuseli and so on and so forth. Racism, colonialism. Amitav Ghosh in The Great Derangement reminds us very forcefully that the Anthropocene is connected, even though he doesn't use the word himself, but the environmental crisis is strongly linked to the exploitation of the on the part of the West of the other continents. And the dark side of cherishing biodiversity, celebrating biodiversity, is to recognize how Western society has created a hierarchical system that for a long time, and arguably still today, categorizes, classifies the humans even in races. So The Tempest is the great play that allows us to talk about colonialism and racism, but not only that. Let me just quickly go to the next slide and then I'll come back. This is an example of how a character of Shakespeare can change over time, acquiring completely different meanings. On upper left corner, you see a detail from a painting by William Hogarth that shows Caliban, this character that has a name that contains possibly the word cannibal in a sort of anagram, described literally as a hybrid monster with webbed feet, a kind of amphibian, deformed monster that seems to exist there simply to confirm the superiority of Prospero, the representative of Europe, the West, England, you choose it. And you see how for most part of the 20th century, Caliban was the monster. And then after or with decolonization, Caliban became a symbol of independence. And so it's quite interesting to work with students and show them two different things. One is that there was a time where, I don't know if you can see it, maybe it's covered, but this is a kind of quirky work from 19th century pseudoscience where the literally highbrow Shakespeare is compared to the skull of a cannibal New Zealand chief. What's the point there? This is a very strange juxtaposition. You have Shakespeare that is literally, I mean, it's not about his receding hairline. It's more like he has a big brain. This is 19th century racial science, phrenology. He's smart and he's alive. The cannibal New Zealand chief is deficient in 19 and all the intellectual organs. And here you see Shakespeare that is gently leaning on kind of strange grotto where we have Caliban, a dark-skinned monster that is coming up. Incidentally, after Darwin, Caliban became the name given to what some scholars thought was the missing link between the ape and the Homo sapiens. So you see how Shakespeare has a way of translating a lot of modern science. What do you think that an image like that is supposed to represent? Why is any clue, any... Yes. The benevolence of the white man. Shakespeare will perhaps even being able to turn even the monster. But there is this very, very famous line in the play where Prospero is almost taken aback that Caliban has rebelled against it. He says, well, I taught you everything. I'm your teacher. You should be just grateful. And he famously says, you taught me language and my profit on it is I learned how to curse. You taught me, and so you gave me the language, but don't expect me to use your language, whether it's Milanese or English, to be following your ideology, your form of racism. I think this is a great play to discuss these very contemporary issues, colonialism, but also to be sort of bold and remind the students that Caliban is not a native in a way. His mother, the witch Sycorax, arrived on the island. So everyone is a migrant. There's no real natives that can claim they have been there forever. And Caliban, though, is the one that is being taught the language. He knows how to say the sun, the moon by Prospero, but he, in turn, is the person who taught Prospero the fresh springs, brine pits, barren place, and fertile. So he's the one who, let's say, shares his ecological knowledge of the place. That is a very important knowledge that, of course, Prospero will use to extract all the resources that he needs. from the island. And what his excuse? Of course, an excuse that has been used several times by various racist regimes, including Italy. Why is Caliban a slave? Because he tried to sleep with Miranda. Thou most lying slave, till thou didst seek to violate the honor of my child. We have to stop to civilize these native savages because they want to sleep with our daughters and pollute the race. This is an argument that, of course, has been going on for a while. But Caliban is also a wonderful figure of emotion and care. Caliban may be a cannibal, Caliban may be a rapist or a supposed rapist, but Caliban is also one of the most poetic figures of the play, and has this beautiful thing that could be the slogan of our use of Shakespeare in ecology: be not afeared, be not afraid. When we are facing an environment that is new, threatening, be not afraid. The isle is full of noises. It has been suggested that maybe Shakespeare is talking about the experience of the English in Ireland. The Tempest is set in the Mediterranean, but there are also a lot of references to the New World. So it's an island with many identities. Some people argue that the island is a character itself, that it has an agency of itself. So to think about the island as its own character. And if you don't have, admittedly, Venice is not at its best in late July, but if you want to have an interesting experience, come to Venice on the 27th of July when there will be an English language production of The Tempest on a very special island called Lazzaretto Nuovo. Lazzaretto Nuovo is the place where the concept of quarantine was first pioneered, roughly in the time of Shakespeare, because the pandemic is another condition. Again, Hamlet comes to mind, that Shakespeare shared with us. Dreaming and waking, the way in which we dream about the place we might lose. Caliban also expresses the idea of a lost natural Eden, maybe. And so he's a multifaceted character that could be seen in many ways, along with his companion Ariel. These are, to me, the most beautiful lines ever written. And they talk about how the metamorphosis of the human into the non-human, into the marine, with a distortion of language, of his bones are coral made. If any of our students used grammar in that way, they would fail. But no, this is even language changes. And Ariel is, as Caliban has been turned from a character that was a monster into a hero of anti-colonial resistance, Ariel is the queer character. And one that can be used to think about the idea of the cyborg, the blurring boundaries between the human, the technological. Very, very interesting historical detail. You know that almost all the characters by Shakespeare were found by him in other sources. He never, he didn't invent Romeo and Juliet. He didn't invent Hamlet. He didn't invent King Lear, Macbeth, blah, blah, blah. Caliban and Ariel are two characters that are his own invention. And there's one interesting theory that what you do when you create a character, you need to think of a costume. This is so much fun. I sometimes ask students to design costumes for the characters. It seems that Shakespeare created the characters after two second-hand costumes that were left to his actors who had performed in a masque. The masque were these very, very rich, elaborate musicals staged for the rich and the aristocrat. And so in one of these very allegorical shows, there were two marine creatures. And whoever the earl, the duke, I can't remember exactly, the aristocrat that had commissioned that story, he loved the performance of the actor so much, he says, you can take the costumes home with you. And so the actor says, all right, let's recycle them in the company. And Shakespeare says, all right, let me think of two characters that could fit these costumes. So that's how maybe Caliban and Ariel were created. There's a great book that I want to recommend. It's a book that was written by Jonathan Bate, former professor in Liverpool, and it's called Song of the Earth. And I think Song of the Earth is the best, at least most readable book that reads English literature through an eco-critical lens. Anything from Shakespeare to Jane Austen to Thomas Hardy. And in the chapter on The Tempest, he says, we should not read Caliban's enslavement separately from the extractivist attitude of natural resources on the island, and also reconsider Ariel as a very important character there. Animals. If there's one topic that it's so important in our eco-critical reflection, is the reflection on non-human animals. This is the cover of a book that has many, many essays on various Shakespeare plays and the representation of animals, the role of animals, animals in the plays, animals on stage. Apparently, the first document of European theater has to do with a man performing with his dog. So there's a long tradition of animals sharing the stage. And there is part of a project of the National Geographic where a photographer called Joel Sartore was asked to take pictures of animals mentioned by Shakespeare that are on the verge of extinction. So one of the many angles is that Shakespeare is also an archive of animals that may be extinct before too long. There was an interesting experiment, can't remember the name. I mentioned him in my book, about an actor that played King Lear with a flock of sheep, real sheep. Was he exploiting them? Maybe, yes. I don't know if you are. But just as a way of showing how you have so many zoological presences in the plays, this is just a list of the animals mentioned in the two Venetian plays. And I think it's no accident, because both The Merchant of Venice and Othello are about the animalization of the outsider. Both Shylock and Othello are frequently compared to animals, real or mythical. I love the story that when people say Shakespeare is a timeless genius, universal, you know that Shakespeare, or you may not know, especially if you're not from Italy, that Shakespeare was not particularly liked in Italy until fairly late. And one of the reasons is that he was not a purist. He liked to mix tragedy and comedy, different forms of languages. So the real anecdote is that the first time that Othello, the Moor of Venice, went on stage in Venice, the curtain had to come down after 5 minutes. Do you remember how Othello starts? Othello starts with Iago and Roderigo, who go under the window of Brabantio and shout a number of things that are not very, very. The Beast of Two Backs. Even now, a black rum is stopping your white ewe. So you're a Venetian and you see Otello Tragedia. You think Tragedia, you think, I was walking down via Alfieri earlier, so you think Alfieri, you think the elevated language of tragedy, with its very precious Greek and Latin models, and a language that is removed from the colloquial in the street, that is the language of comedy. And you sit down and you have two soldiers that shout abuse at Brabant. Literally, after 5 minutes, they started booing, the curtain gone down, and the actor is recorded to have said, "Nose robe par no altri." These are not things for ourselves, So and it took opera, it took ballet to make Othello acceptable. But anyway, to look through animal imagery, Shylock is called a dog repeatedly. There are so many dog references, and also it's a way of studying how the dog in Shakespeare is a very different type of animal than it is in our culture. And so you can, let's say, historicize animals. Right now, I'm doing a very fascinating project with a German director who is interested in story by Franz Kafka, where there is a speaking ape. Report to an academy, there is Red Peter, who's an ape who has learned how to speak in a human tongue, and he's talking to academics. And so we're doing a strange thing where I imagine that Kafka's monkey speaks with Shylock's monkey, because there's a monkey in The Merchant of Venice. So what happens if you do a lot of monkeys? Talking again about another keyword, performance. The best way to make Shakespeare relevant and to give it a kind of ecological significance is to imagine and to study past performances. So, because I live in this beautiful city, there's also a threatened city, a city where pollution, over-tourism, depopulation are very real. And these real problems, these real social and environmental problems are kind of overshadowed by the beauty and the whole veneer of the tourist industry. How do these contemporary environmental topics can be associated with Shakespeare? And so 2 examples from the past. One fascinating thing is 1974, a professor of English literature that was also a very erudite and sophisticated scholar wrote an adaptation of Othello, where he deconstructed the text and wrote this play called Cassio Governa Cipro. But the fascinating thing was that the Biennale, the theater festival, decided to stage it not on a regular theater, but in the petrochemical factory that would soon become the infamous, notorious place of one of the great scandals, the great environmental catastrophe, where hundreds of people were left to work with very highly pollutant and poisonous material, creating PVC. So, and what is fascinating is that Manganelli makes nothing of it. It doesn't say, all right, I'm going to connect Othello to the factory. But in fact, it created this sort of short circuit. And so we can study what it means to play Othello. And Othello, what is Othello about? Othello is about jealousy, about racism, but as great scholar Alessandro Serpieri said, Othello may be the first tragedy in Western literature that is completely based on fake news. It's about something that didn't happen. It's not about, Hamlet, father was killed. It's not about Macbeth, everyone was killed. It's not about Julius Caesar was killed. It's about something that didn't happen and then eventually killed. The workers of the factory were people that were denied in the beautiful definition of one of the great scholars of the environmental humanities, Serenella Iovino. If you don't know her book, Paesaggio Civile, please, or in English, Italy and Eco-Criticism. These workers were denied cognitive justice. Cognitive justice is the justice, the right to know in what kind of environment you are working. And it took a trial to demonstrate, to ascertain that they were working in very highly unhealthy circumstances. 10 years ago, my university embarked in a very interesting project called The Merchant in Venice, where The Merchant of Venice was staged for the first time in the ghetto of Venice. And so one challenge is to say, where can we stage a play by Shakespeare, creating a kind of dialectical relationship between the play and the place, where the ecological themes of the play can illuminate the ecological ramifications and entanglements and properties of a certain area, and vice versa. So there's no play by Shakespeare that exists in a vacuum. I've seen The Tempest staged in Liverpool on a carpet, 3 actors on a carpet. And so just that many. And then, end of part 1. Part 2. But before I move to part 2, let me ask you if you have any questions, comments, or... In the second part, I would like to look more closely at one particular play. One play, the play, Hamlet. And I like to do that because before I started reading all this eco-critical criticism of Shakespeare, I would never had thought of Hamlet as an ecological play. Before that, even though I was not particularly interested in this type of studies, I knew that Midsummer Night's Dream was about, or As You Like It, it was about forest, The Tempest about the sea, but I would not have listed this particular play. And yet, Hamlet has everything in it. So, And Simon Estock, that's one of the most authoritative scholars of eco-critical Shakespeare, has written a book that was there at the very beginning. By the way, I don't know what is the rule here, but I'd be very happy to share the presentation, to leave the slides with you so that you can have a look at them. And so Simon Estock, in this book called Eco-Criticism in Shakespeare, reading Ecophobia, a book from 2011, has this wonderful notion of ecophobia. What is ecophobia? He says that is something that is equivalent to racism, misogyny, and homophobia. So it's one of the great forms of prejudice and intolerance of our time, and is hatred of nature. Hatred of the natural world. And he gives some strange examples. One of the examples is heavily manicured poodles, so that little dogs that are loved, but also taken care in such a way that you almost try to humanize them. And so the idea is that in a lot of our society, nature comes only when it's tamed, when it's a beautifully manicured garden using an inordinate amount of water, when we have dogs that are fed type of food that would, feed a lot of human beings. And he gives a list of famous passages that show that Hamlet doesn't like nature. This majestical roof, this almost parody of Renaissance anthropocentrism. What is the world? A foul and pestilent congregation of vapors. This is a picture of a fantastic production. I mean, one picture is famous, Laurence Olivier holding the skull. But that's another amazing production of Hamlet by the German director Thomas Ostermeier, where he literally brought, 3 tons of dirt on stage. So dirt and water. When we go to the theater, we dress up, especially in Italy, and it's actually said officially, don't sit too close. If you sit too close to the stage, be prepared to get wet. the sun breed maggots in a dead dog, being a good kissing carrion. And Hamlet also has horrible things to say about her mother's bed. So in the case of Hamlet, you have misogyny and ecophobia. In the book, if you're interested in a little bit of I was going to say gossip, but it's not gossip. I take issue with the very annoying interpretation of Hamlet made by a celebrity like our former mayor Massimo Cacciari, who's a philosopher who is always on TV and is highly misogynist and has a very strong interpretation of Hamlet, where he likes Ophelia because Ophelia is silent. Yes, thank you for that. That's exactly my point. So my pages is basically an extended comments on that kind of laughter. So when I read Cacciari's interpretation of Hamlet, I was very annoyed. But admittedly, I had not noticed that there was a counterpoint to that, or at least I had not fully appreciated there is a counterpoint to Hamlet's ecophobia. And even Simon Estock, that has inspired my reading, has nothing to say about Ophelia. So Ophelia is now the next 12 slides is Ophelia. So the rest of this is Ophelia, which is why I called my book Planet Ophelia. Ophelia, ecophobia, ecophilia. You like that? Fun, it didn't work in Italian, but So in this interpretation of Cacciari's, Ophelia is the one who resists. I mean, I don't want to simplify, Cacciari is a very sophisticated philosopher, but his idea is that Hamlet is part of the same value system that nurtures a cycle of violence where even revenge is basically just confirming the values that killed his father. But he says, and of course, Cacciari is obsessed with the Virgin Mary, and so Ophelia is a sort of figure of the Virgin Mary. And I compare unfavorably Cacciari's reading with another philosophical reading by Adriana Cavarero, a very influential and now controversial feminist philosopher, who has a reading of Ophelia as not as a silent figure, but as a very embodied corporeal figure that is connected to the water. But Ophelia is not silent. Ophelia is not a silent character at all. Ophelia speaks a lot, speaks verbally and speaks in the language of nature. She is the one who gives out plans. So now I'm going to do something that I've never done before. Daniela, I may be fired for that, but I promise this morning I walked from different places, that's flower shops and herbal pharmacy thing, and I went to all of them and says, I would like to bring to this festival called Living with Grace some grace, because Ophelia, amongst the others herbs that she talks about the herb of grace, la ruta. The only thing I could use was grappa with ruta. That's something you are not supposed to do with your students, so please don't do it with your students. But I promise, exactly, yeah. We're gonna be on fire. Maybe later, if among adults, we could use that. But this is the only ruta that I could find. I'm actually quoting a beautiful essay by a colleague who writes something very simple. What if you teach Ophelia and you bring rosemary? That would have been easier, just going to Kona, then bring rosemary. That's what you do. And you just have a little twig of rosemary and you rub it. It makes a huge difference. All of a sudden, the multisensorial aspect of Shakespeare is tangible. Now, but why grace, not only to honor the thing. Because what does grace, the herb of grace, represent? Ruta. So the wonderful woman who sold me this bottle, and she said that Ruta Ru has a psychotropic property. It is called herb of grace. This is the most famous herbarium of Shakespeare's time, Herbal, by John Gerard, says that you can use this for a number of reasons. So Ophelia is not simply the type of woman that would be associated with flowers, because that's another kind of sexist stereotype. She has a very sophisticated understanding of the different properties of these various plants. Every plant, there's fennel for you. It's a relational understanding. Every person has a specific link with the symbolic, the medical, the religious quality of the different plants. Apparently, rue was called herbs of grace because it was connected to the act of blessing people, with sprinkling with twigs of rue on the people. And don't need to, maybe, yes, it's worth remembering that in that particular time, and we're talking in Trento of all places, that grace was one huge issue in the divide between Catholic and Protestants in Shakespeare's time. But grace was also used as to perform abortions. So it also had a sort of, we could call it proto-feminist aspect. So there's a kind of ambivalence, and it's great to engage with this kind of knowledge and not simply stop at the more superficial understanding of, oh, Ophelia is a crazy woman who just talks about flowers. There is a very specific, I would say, counter culture represented by Ophelia. What is the only herbal, knowledge that the other characters have? The one that is used to create poisons, because we know that, of course, Hamlet, like many other Shakespeare plays, has to do with poisons. When this super famous painting was first put on display in London in the mid-19th century, what do you think the reception was? Because this is one of the most iconic paintings, perhaps the best known Shakespeare-inspired painting. Sorry. Do you happen to know? Do you happen to know how this painting was made? This painting was made by literally immersing the model in ice cold water and also giving her pneumonia. So John Everett Millais had a live model just in a bathtub. What is the this has been made in multiple posters and a lot of neo-Victorian imagery. What does that represent in terms of relationship between the woman and nature in your reading? A very close relations. One of the critics of the time was outraged that Ophelia was like dumped into among weeds. So we see that as a very beautiful, lyrical, even though heartbreaking scenario. But Adriana Caballero has this beautiful reading of that as this century-old relationship between women and water. And so you can also read that not only through the vegetal angle, but also through we call the blue humanities angle, the water aspect of that. And this is what I invited my students to do. So I teach a class called Ecology and Literature, where I ask students to do things. Right now, I'm working on a new project called Shakespeare's Waters. We're looking at the representation of waters in Shakespeare, and the students work in groups, and every group has a specific theme. We have the ship group, the fresh waters group, the water mythology group, the multi-species group, and so on and so forth. And they have to work in that. But before that, last year, I did this Ophelia project where we looked at various adaptations or spin-offs, reimaginings of this iconic image of Ophelia. And by looking at how Ophelia has been represented and over the years, we see how also the changing notions of nature can be brought into the discussion. So what's the difference between Ophelia drowned in water and an Ophelia lying on the grass? And what about the difference between a realistic Ophelia and a surrealistic Ophelia? That'd be nice if we could. And then there's a Barbie Ophelia. And this is a typical meme where, in a way that it's, to me, thought-provoking, but kind of heavy-handed, you say, right, yes, if Ophelia were drowned today, there would be a lot of plastic floating around. But that's a sort of victim, yes. Yeah, a lamb, yeah. So you see her as a sacrificial victim figure, yeah. I mean, probably even the definition of the images is not good enough. Anyway, I'm not interested now in necessarily comparing the various version, but it's a good exercise to see how every time and place has a different notion of the relationship between the human and the environment. So the housewife Ophelia that drowns in her house chores and in a domestic environment completely devoid of any vegetal presence, right? So it's literally. And this is where I also invited a wonderful contemporary artist called Sara Lando, based in Bassano, that likes to explore the agency of non-human forms like mold and bacteria. So she took a picture of a woman that, of course, she puts a woman that looks dead in the water. You don't even need to call it Ophelia. It's already a quotation and a reference. So what she did was to take a very beautiful picture, almost kind of cliche type of fashion, modern fashion version of Ophelia, and then cover this image, this prototypical image, with some mold, bacteria that started eroding the body. So John Everett Millay, Ophelia is a symbol of kind of eternal feminine beauty that is dead, but also alive because has been immortalized by art. Sara Lando was to say, no, there's no eternal beauty guaranteed by art, And so every few weeks, he would remove the image, take a picture of the image, and see all this, documenting this process of deterioration, of decay, of decline. So this idea of this eternal feminine beauty is that is implied by the likes of Cacciari is strongly contrasted with this decaying Ophelia. And this is where I started asking students to do their Ophelia. And this is the kind of exercise I think it's truly, truly beautiful. So I asked my students in groups, most of them are women, to recreate their own Ophelia. And I'm just going to show you, there's a couple of clips and just a few images. So this is the one group. And she dies. These students are digital natives. They're amazing. They have a certain skills that we don't have. And I must tell you that I was completely mesmerized by their now how could I go back to the I know that this was going to happen. Oh yes. Another group did a kind of fotoromanzo, a neo-Victorian photographic novel where they actually baked cakes made with flowers. I also gave the real thing to me. And some engaged with Venice and with environmental disasters. So this is a South African student who poses as Ophelia on the banks of Venice with the lagoon, and so referencing the water of Venice and connecting them to those of the brook where Ophelia drowned. Another group referenced an environmental catastrophe. Gertrude talks about Ophelia's muddy death. It was an environmental catastrophe, and I think it was in can't remember. Sorry, it's my mistake. I think it was in South America, where an entire village was covered with mud, and there was this terrible picture of this boy drowning in the mud. And so they took a still from a recent film called Ophelia, and so they made Ophelia dying a really muddy death with the references of various forms of yes, it was Colombia. So they mixed the vegetation of Venice with the vegetation of the place where this environmental disaster occurred. 30 seconds, I have to share that the most bizarre experience I've ever had in my career was to give a lecture about this at the Association of Vegetal Science. My colleague, the botanist, invited me to, says, we would like to have some humanities. And I gave a version of this talk to a group of botanists. And at the end of that, they were completely silent. And one of them raised their hand and says, that is not Tripolium pannonicum, it's actually Tripolium veneticum. I said, I'm sorry. I said, well, point well taken. I mean, I would have the same reaction if the botanist gave a lecture on Shakespeare and said that Hamlet's brother is, Hamlet has a brother. And then others, just making portraits of Ophelia using various types of and one where Ophelia is literally drowning in a Venice canal, surrounded by flowers that actually flower made of Murano glass. And the Murano glass represents the monopoly of tourism on Venice. So you see how there are so many different layers that they managed to create. And I just told them, make your own Ophelia. That's the extent of what I told them. And I, through these different versions, and I've only given you a few, I have learned so much about the ecological potential of the place. Back to Hamlet, in conclusion. Is poor Hamlet only to be seen as an ecophobic, misogynistic man. Has anyone visited Hamlet's castle in Denmark? Okay, it's a fascinating place. It has a lot of water. It's a castle on the water, and in my imagination, Hamlet's was a far more landlocked place. And I remember reading a fascinating piece of information saying that oysters were very, very cheap and available there. I would think of oysters. So that the Danish court traveling there would have oysters for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. But lemon to dress the oyster was something that could cost the equivalent of 800 euros, because try to ship a lemon from, Amalfi to Elsinore, and that's where things get tricky. Eating. There is this very, very famous moment where Hamlet, the serial killer who just killed Polonius, Rosencrantz, Guildenstern, Hamlet, to be or not to be, he's a serial killer, isn't he? Kills Polonius, and then they ask him, where is Polonius? And he says, he's at supper, not where he eats, but where he is eaten. He is eaten. Famous pun on the diet of worms. And here Hamlet is basically recycling or quoting, it's not recycling, quoting a famous trope that goes back to ancient philosophy, of the fact that a man may fish with the worm that hath teeth of a king and eat of the fish that hath head of this worm. Meaning that even though medieval theology said that the king had two bodies, a divine body and a human body, even a king dies. And when the king dies, he rots and he becomes cadavere, worm, worm food. And so if the worm eats the king and the worm is used to fish, the fish eat the king and you eat the fish, so you're eating. So this cycle of cannibalism and I thought that one could read this famous scene by Hamlet in connection with a very, very thought-provoking eco-feminist book by the Australian philosopher Val Plumwood called The Eye of the Crocodile, where she talks about her experience of having been attacked by a crocodile and surviving the attack. And where she starts a very powerful meditation that says one way of going beyond this sharp divide between the human and the non-human is to stop thinking in terms of she lost a child. So she had also this other tragic experience, again, thinking about Hamlet, of trying to preserve the human body from this imagery of decay, and says we should think of ourselves as food. I became food for the crocodile. And thinking of ourselves as food can put us in a completely different perspective vis-a-vis the non-human world. So Hamlet may be ecophobic, but he also creates a space to think about the way in which we eat and with which we exploit animals for our own consumption. And there's one person who took, in a way, that philosophy in a very literal matter. There was a composer, a Polish composer called Andrzej Tchaikovsky, same name as the famous composer, who a pianist and a composer, who died and left his body to science, which is something that a lot of noble people do. But he says, I'm going to live all my body to science from my neck down, but not my head. My head goes to the Royal Shakespeare Company. I would like the skull to be used in Hamlet. So he recycled his own skull for artistic purposes. There were some few legal issues, but then in 2008, great actor David Tennant, also a very famous TV, actually did perform Hamlet holding the skull of Andrei Tchaikovsky in his head. It's gross, I understand. But it is also something that makes you think about why we want to, in a way, protect ourselves from the thinking that death is something very material, very, very. I haven't asked my students to do anything with that, for just to be sure. But one thing that I've asked them to do, and they have done very beautifully, is to take inspiration from something that is a form of art, a way of recognizing that Shakespeare can also be done not just with human actors, but also with things. Tabletop Shakespeare is a form of Shakespeare performance that originated before COVID, but that during the lockdown shifted from being one quirky show into a whole series of homemade shows where a single actor sitting at a table was performing a play by Shakespeare only using recycled objects from his home. Being English actors at home, you can imagine that there was a huge number of. So this is a clip of Hamlet. Let's see here.
Hamlet's on his way to take the ship to England, and he stops at a plane, and in the distance he can see young Fortinbras of Norway, and he's leading an army of 20,000 men, and they cross the plain on their way to attack the Poles. And Hamlet thinks to himself, everything he sees, every event that he witnesses shames him and informs against him. He thinks Fortinbras is so honourable that he is prepared to sacrifice 20,000 men for a little bit of land that's worth nothing.
Okay, I invite you to explore this because not only is this a great theatrical feat, but it's also a great methodology to invite the students to reenact Shakespeare on their desk with recycled stuff. So let me just 1 minute 21 show you the Ophelia's funeral staged at the Lido beach in Venice by students who picked discarded material that was left on the beach. And thank you.